This story began one fine day when the little blonde girl's brother came to her with a new portion of medicine. This liquid looked very terrible, and therefore the girl definitely did not want to try it. However, Percival insisted on it. The guy handed her a whole bowl of this liquid and asked if she really refused to drink it, because the girl even started waving her hands to the sides. He looked Orleene straight in the eye and said that he had gone through a lot of trouble to get this thing for her. He pointed to this horrible, ugly, smelly, purple liquid and asked if she really didn't want to try it. Percival was the crown prince of the empire, but in fact the girl looked away from him and said that it was not that she did not want to, it was just that it was difficult. Orleene wanted to live out the rest of her life quietly. Unfortunately, she was unable to do this because she had an incredibly caring brother. Percival said that some say that it is the elixir of health, and he personally climbed to the top of Mount Cruan, all in soul, and fought the monster to get its heart. The guy explained that it was definitely impossible to buy something like this for money. It was imbued with all his sincerity, so he really wanted her to drink this medicine. In the end, Orleene simply had no choice, so she agreed to drink it and actually did it. The guy had been watching her closely all this time. After she finished, he immediately applauded and ran to the girl. Orleene, meanwhile, thought that now everything she had eaten over the last week would come out from this terrible medicine. And of course she felt unpleasant. But Percival was very glad that she drank it all to the bottom. He said that she was the best, and also added that since she drank this medicine, she definitely should not have fainted that day. So he said that he really hoped that he would not see her fall again. Before she fell, she had to even ask him for permission. Orleene did not listen to him at all. She did not understand. Why did he say all these things at all? And she hoped that this terrible feeling from the medicine would end soon. However, her brother in the meantime said that since her medicine was already inside, then in that case they could start for real. After this, the doors opened and an Orleene medical council of imperial knights appeared there. It was a multitude of luminaries of imperial medicine. The guy said that this was all the cream that he could get, especially for her, and there really were a multitude of different specialists there. Orleene, who was still feeling terrible in the meantime, asked the guy why he was trying so hard, because she didn't see any point in it. But Percival replied that she had taken the medicine. This meant that they had to check how much the girl had been able to get stronger. At that moment, he called those same imperial knights to him. They gave the girl a small dumbbell and told her to do some strength exercises. Orleene was completely unprepared and did not expect this at all. After that, she was even forced to run several laps around the mansion. The girl thought that in this way she would die before she recovered, and that she would still have the same end. Some time passed since then, and Orleene finally sat down. She was really very tired after this strength training, which she did not expect at all. Percival then asked if she was already tired, sighing heavily. He said that she was apparently incredibly weak, and this made him sad. But the guy with a smile on his face said that she should get better soon, so that they could go hiking and hunt monsters together. He told her not to worry about anything, because he would definitely make her healthy no matter what it cost him. But Orleene was not at all happy about this. The girl only hoped that at least someone would take this madman away from her, who didn't even know what he was doing. In fact, she was a 12-year-old violinist, a genius child prodigy who was marked by heaven and conquered the world with her talent. Ultimately, it was her life that was cut short. She was hit not by just any truck on the road. It was a luxury sedan that cut her life short very quickly. And she ended up reincarnated as a character from the novel, which the girl certainly didn't expect. Immediately after Orleene found herself in the small body, it was not in a dream. It was in the middle of her walk with the maids. And of course, the girls immediately became worried about her. They didn't understand at all what had happened, because she stopped abruptly. But in the end, Orleene could hardly count how many novels she had read until the end of her life. So she didn't understand what kind of world she had ended up in. But soon, she learned that she was the main character of this story. Her name was Orleene. She was the heiress of the ducal family of Halburn, one of the 5 great families of the empire. And she was the only heir to that house. The girl first thought that it was the same as being born with a diamond spoon in her mouth. And of course, for a while, she was really madly happy about it. However, the dizziness as soon as she woke up and the body that was suffocating after the slightest load made her doubt. Orleene didn't understand after another bout of vomiting what kind of aristocratic body she had. She didn't even think that she had health problems. She eventually found out that she was terminally ill, and that was why she had these symptoms. Her thoughts involuntarily became confused, and with each moment, the memories of her past life became clearer and clearer. Gradually, she began to hear things that a child should not hear. These were conversations between various aristocrats and maids. She knew that they were talking about her. People were talking about the Duke of Halburn bringing his daughter from somewhere, but no one even knew who her mother was. They considered Orleene to be a real disgrace, as she was the illegitimate child of Lord Galburn. And it was true, she was the mysterious daughter whom the Duke suddenly brought home, leaving Orleene in the care of the manager, and he went alone to the northern borders. And soon he died before she was even 10, and took the truth to the grave, so Orleene didn't know who she was. But ultimately, she knew that she was a minor character who only appeared a few times in the original story, and that she was a terminally ill heroine who was supposed to die at an early age. Orleene was also the protagonist's childhood friend to change Roman's predetermined fate and open her own business and become stronger. This was her original plan. But of course, in order for her to be able to carry it out, the girl first had to gain weight. The girl didn't know what to do with this junk. She finally remembered her past life, but there wasn't a drop of enthusiasm in her. For a whole week, Orleene did practically nothing because she simply did not have the strength to do so due to her illness. Therefore, the girl thought about the fact that the time had finally come when her only protector was supposed to appear, and at that moment, a tall adult man suddenly knocked on her door. And this man was Mikail. He turned to Lady Orleene and asked if he could enter her room. The maids who stood behind and watched everything that was happening were surprised. After all, they did not think that Mikail would arrive. They were going to leave there as soon as possible so as not to disturb him. In the end, the girl still allowed him to enter. Mikail was the manager of the duchy, and as soon as he entered Milady's room, he immediately greeted her and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He said that he heard that she had not left her room lately, so he decided to come and check on her to make sure that everything was okay with her. In fact, Mikail was the poor guardian of the girl. The man, without looking up from his papers, immediately said that if someone offended the girl or something bothered her, she should let him know immediately. Orleene didn't understand why he spoke as if he were an official at a garage reception, but she didn't make any comments to him about it. In fact, Mikail was the predator of the estate. He was born a commoner, and from his early years was known as a true genius. He served as the Duke of Halburn's manager, chief assistant, and manager of the capital's mansion. During the time when the girl did not remember her past life, she was afraid of Mikail because of his severe aura. Now he looked like an overworked office worker, so she stopped being afraid of him at all and even began to treat him with some sympathy. Mikail suddenly looked at the girl and saw that she was looking at him strangely, so he asked if she really wanted to say something. Orleene smiled and said that they really hadn't seen each other for a long time and that she was happy to finally meet him. The guy was a little surprised by this. However, he asked what was wrong. Because she was behaving very strangely, the girl immediately replied that everything was fine and he didn't need to worry. But Mikail continued to insist on his own. He said that he had started attending a childcare group and heard that the girl had not been going out anywhere recently. But Orleene turned to Mikail and asked if he remembered that, before he couldn't stand it when she went out somewhere. Because of this, he had to be very nervous and worried. She also said that because any walk puts too much strain on her heart, he actually asked her to limit it because it could make her feel worse. She looked away from him and said in a gentle voice that he shouldn't worry, that she would definitely behave well and wouldn't stick her neck out so that everyone would be calmer. Mikail just looked at the girl in surprise for a while. He knew that something was wrong. However, he didn't tell her anything about it. He simply agreed. After that, the guy returned to his office. He was still thinking about this whole situation and was quite worried about it. Mikail didn't know what was wrong. However, he knew for sure that something was wrong. Although only a few months had passed since their last meeting, the girl had changed a lot. Mikail turned to his assistant and said that it was necessary to assemble a group to care for the children. He looked very serious and told him to order them to gather immediately. It was very important, so there was no time to waste. In fact, even the incredibly capable manager of the Galberna estate, Mikail, felt helpless in a completely different area, namely caring for children. He came to the conclusion that it would be best to entrust this to experts and began to involve them, not sparing even the Lord's funds for this. Graduates of the Hornist International Academy of Butlers and Maids were the cream of society. In terms of caring for Orleene, which consisted of theoretically impeccable talents, it was really very good, and it was known as a childcare group. Soon everyone was gathered at one large table. Mikail said what was bothering him, and when they agreed with him, he summed up that they felt it too. After this, he invited everyone to speak in turn in order to draw some final conclusion to this. The maid I was the eldest in, and her name was Rena. She said that the girl looked strangely lifeless, as if her sense of sensation had dulled. She locked herself in the room and did not come out. The head butler, Ernst, agreed with her. He said that she smiled much less often than before, even when they tried to make her laugh. She only forced a smile, which was very noticeable. They were all very worried about it and thought that maybe something had happened. But they also thought that if something had happened, they would have been the first to know about it. Then Mikail asked how her health was, because he thought that perhaps it had worsened. And, accordingly, because of this, she began to behave differently. But the main thing is that the maid said that the court doctor says that everything is normal, and absolutely no new complications were discovered. Another maid said that it was the first time she had suddenly withdrawn into herself, so they were all very worried. Her partner agreed and said in a quiet voice that before they had to forbid her from leaving the house. However, now it is impossible to even see her face on the estate. You need to go to the room to do this. Mikail then seriously thought about this. He did not understand what the matter was, and it worried him greatly. Then suddenly, Renee stood up from her seat and said that she thought and remembered that tomorrow was that very day. This was the day when the young lady was to visit the imperial palace, and it was indeed a very important event. It was that very day of the meeting with the main character, or rather the official Soviet reception intended to strengthen the ties between the crown prince, the noble heirs, and the rest of the imperial importance. Perhaps due to the advanced magical engineering in this world, there was so much that was interesting that Orleene couldn't help but admire its design. And the imperial palace was the center of wealth of technology, and in this place, everything looked especially luxurious. Therefore, the next day when the girl went there, she could not stop looking at everything around. Her miserable body was very tired. She had walked only a little and was already ready to lie down for the whole day and restore her strength and energy. Soon, Lady Orleene was met by the servants of the imperial palace and escorted to the right room where they were already waiting for her. This was Albert's future. There were many different children of aristocrats gathered there, and the girl stood for some time just at the entrance, looking at them all with special caution. Looking at them all, she thought that it was like looking at celebrities. She looked in one direction and literally saw the fates of these people. Orleene knew that one of them would become a notorious ladies' man, and the other would turn into a mad sword master. And altogether, they were supposed to weave a scandalous love triangle that would shake the entire empire. Of course, it was a little strange for Orleene to realize that she knew someone's future, even though she had no part in it. However, while she was sitting away from everyone for a while, the girl suddenly heard His Highness Crown Prince Percival enter the room. The girl immediately began to look in the same direction where the main character of this novel had come. And when she saw him in person, she was very surprised because she couldn't even imagine that he could look like that. She did not understand how a 7-year-old child could be as beautiful as Perl, a guy who had blonde hair and red eyes, smiling happily and greeting everyone present. After they had talked for a while, the children all gathered in one place, and Percival asked what they would play that day. He asked who had the idea because he wanted to listen to them and ultimately decide on one thing. In fact, the children did not know what to do. They had absolutely no ideas in their heads, and then one of them asked if they would like to just go outside. Others immediately began to support this idea. After all, they really loved playing outdoors. They also decided to play Find the Ball. Everyone immediately began to agree because this idea was really amazing. Orleene was very upset as soon as she heard this. After all, they all had so much energy in their bodies and lives. But she couldn't even get up from a chair without getting tired. In the end, all the children ran out into the yard very quickly, and she was the only one left sitting inside. But Orleene didn't understand at all why she was surprised at all. No one cared about her existence. Therefore, at some point, it even seemed to her that no one even noticed that she was present with them at all. She was the only and precious daughter of the House of Hallberg, a pearl in a frame of nobility, that's what everyone called her. But the reality was much more prosaic. Even in the Halburn estate, Orleene was just a shadow, regardless of her title. She was treated like an empty space. And when the girl realized that she had been reborn, of course, she dreamed of only one thing: a warm, loving family, where memory is the most precious treasure. But alas, even in her second life, she was not destined to receive this. Unfortunately, Orleene did not receive this very family that she had dreamed of for two. The girl did not understand at all why she hoped for all this, because she knew her luck very well, and should have already understood in advance that nothing good should be expected. When she finally decided to get up and go to the other children in order to keep up with them, the maid, as soon as she saw that it was so hard for her to get up, immediately ran up to her. She told Orleene that she would like to walk her, but the girl smiled and replied that everything was fine with her. She could walk on her own. There were no problems with that. After that, she quickly began to walk away from the maid, and of course the housemaid did not like it. But the girl walked so quickly that she did not even have time to follow her. In fact, in the novels, Orleene was described as very sick, and that is probably why she could not play with the other children. But she still tried her best not to stay on the sidelines, so she tried to be where they were. However, the girl, now that she was reborn, did not understand why she had to put in so much effort. She did not want to waste her energy in vain, so she went in a completely different direction from the playground. Orleene thought that she would just kill time and return home. So the girl went to the forest, which was nearby, but not to those children who could calmly play among themselves. She was going to rest in the shade for a while, because she didn't understand why she was exhausting herself trying to impress people who didn't even notice her. Soon a light breeze would blow, and thus the girl seemed to clarify her thoughts. She was very pleased with this company, and therefore she enjoyed every minute. And then, suddenly, Orleene heard some rustling not far from her in the bushes. Looking more closely, she saw a small white tail that was peeking out from behind the greenery. The girl smiled and immediately thought that it was a kitten. Then she looked more closely and saw a beautiful white cat. She remembered that she had seen it before. Orleene couldn't believe that the emperor or empress kept him as a python, but she decided to come closer and get acquainted. The girl extended her hand and decided to pet her. However, the cat didn't like it at all, so she quickly ran away from her. The girl was very surprised and immediately started following her and asked where the cat had disappeared to. Orleene tried to find her. However, suddenly she felt that her hand had come across someone else's. Raising her head up, she saw that it was the Crown Prince Percival. Seeing him, the girl was very surprised. Just like the boy himself, he immediately asked who she was and what she was doing in this place. Orleene quickly moved away from him. She didn't understand what the boy was doing in this place and why he wasn't playing with the other children. But the girl understood that she couldn't show such disrespect, so she had to answer him. So after bowing, she said that she should be from the Halburn family. Then the boy asked why she was alone. After all, everyone else was playing together, but she was here without even a maid. The girl replied that she was feeling a little unwell to play with the others, so she decided to spend time in this beautiful forest. The guy immediately asked if she was sick. He was afraid that she might get worse. Orleene answered that this was indeed the case. Even a short run completely deprived her of strength. After she said this, there was an awkward silence between them, and because of this, the girl felt even more uncomfortable. She really hoped that he would understand the hint as soon as possible and simply leave, leaving her alone. But Percival continued to stand in front of her and asked her how she could faint from running. He said that she was definitely deceiving him, and he didn't believe her at all. Orleene, at that moment, simply hoped that he would leave, because all of this was already starting to irritate her. The girl simply smiled nervously and said that she was not lying to him. Then the guy asked her to prove to him that her words were really true and asked her to run a little. The girl, hearing this, was even more surprised. She did not understand. Did he really mean it? The guy continued to insist on his own and told her to run away. If she said she wasn't lying, then she could prove it to him. Orleene understood that arguing with him was absolutely useless. Therefore, sighing heavily, she decided to do it quickly and finish with this. After that, she thought that she would remember this act and thought that he was some kind of psychopathic crown prince, since he really forced a sick person to do something like this. Then she looked around and thought that it was just perfect weather to lose consciousness. Orleene nevertheless plucked up her courage and started running. Even the start was very difficult for her. She ran some distance and began to reproach her worthless body even more, which was practically incapable of anything. The girl continued to run and did not understand why she had not yet lost consciousness. She assumed that she had already run quite a long way. However, soon she felt how her eyes began to darken. Orleene was unable to react in any way, so she eventually began to fall, losing consciousness. But Percival luckily managed to notice this in time, so he reacted. The guy quickly ran up to the girl and picked her up so that she wouldn't get hurt. At that very moment, a maid walked past them, as always, inspecting the area around her. Seeing that the girl had lost consciousness, the maid immediately became worried. She began to run towards the estate and loudly shouted for someone to call a doctor, because the little lady had become ill. And when some time passed from that moment and Orleene was returned to the estate, Mikail was very alarmed and even angry. That day, there was supposed to be a friendly meeting between the crown prince and the most worthy heirs of the empire to play for the future, and he thought that it was a pretty safe place, so he sent her away. However, Orleene ultimately collapsed and was brought back unconscious without any explanation from the imperial palace. He couldn't believe that such a treatment was given even to a member of the Halbert family, and so he assumed that the imperial family was definitely involved in all of this. Yes, the guy went into his office, where his council had already gathered. Then he heard loud screams. The maids and butlers discussed the whole situation that had happened and believed that this was a declaration of war on their house. They also wanted to demand an explanation from the palace itself. After all, it was definitely impossible to do that. But as soon as Mikail went inside, he immediately calmed them down and said that they would deal with the palace. But a little more. The guy sat down at his place and asked how the little lady was feeling now. After all, he hadn't received any news for some time. The main thing is that the maid replied that the girl had woken up. However, she gave the order for isolation. She doesn't want to see anyone, and for this reason, they don't even know what she's doing there. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, Percival was summoned by his mother. She looked very strict and wanted to talk to her son about a serious topic. When the guy came to her office, she said that she heard that he was rude to the girl from Halberg and asked what his mother always tells him about behavior. Percival sighed heavily and said that he knew that he had to be kind to everyone. And because of this, he himself felt a little uneasy about the situation that had happened there in general. But his mother told the boy to remember that actions always have consequences, so he had to immediately go to the Halburn house and bring Lady Orleene a sincere apology for what happened. She also told him to take into account the fact that until he is forgiven, his tea, desserts, and even a piece of chocolate will all be prohibited. As soon as Percival heard this, he was very shocked. He could not believe that his mother really wanted to forbid him all this. He loved sweets very much, and therefore it was difficult for him to accept the fact that he was being deprived of them. At that very moment, Orleene was on her veranda drinking tea with sweets. She didn't let anyone in, and she felt very good. In fact, it was still hard for her to accept the fact that she was as fragile as the moonfish. Of course, she was well aware of the fact that her body was weak and could not withstand the load. However, she did not understand how she could faint when she had only run a few meters. She really thought that she could do something, but in the end, it turned out that this was not the case. At that moment, she suddenly heard some conversations downstairs. This conversation belonged to the maids who were passing by. One of them asked the other if he was really going to give the order. Another laughed and said that she actually did all this only to attract attention, and because of this, they felt very sorry for Lord Mikail, because he really worries about her. And another one, smiling slyly, said that the young man in the prime of his life was stuck in the responsibilities of caring for children, and because of this, he was even more tired. In fact, Orleene was already well accustomed to situations like these. She always knew that they were talking behind their backs, and it was the same in her past life. People around her always humiliated her, said that she had no talent, that she was ugly, and that she was not capable of anything at all, although this was not true. They thought that she only spoiled and broke everything, so the girl tried to embellish it all on purpose. But when everyone turned away from her, she understood perfectly well that no one believed her. Therefore, the life in which she now found herself was absolutely no different from her previous one, and the girl did not become upset at all, because she was perfectly accustomed to this kind of treatment. She actually just wanted to have a mother who would love her, and that would be enough for her. But she couldn't even find that in her new life. Mikail, meanwhile, was in his office, very worried and concerned. He actually couldn't even imagine that raising a child could be so difficult. He remembered the words of the girl who said that everything would be fine with her, but he realized that it was just a deception, and he needed to be much more attentive to her. In fact, Orleene was his master's daughter, and he had to raise her when she was still very young. Of course, it was a very difficult task. However, the man assumed that this was precisely why he could not leave her completely in the hands of the nannies. He tied her up. Like this girl, he considered it his duty to raise her as a worthy person. He was just a caretaker who had been around her for a while, and in fact, he tried not to get too attached to her so that it wouldn't be painful to let her go soon. Of course, Mikail tried to draw boundaries between them, but in the end, all the girl needed was a family, and he was the only person who could give her that. At that moment, his assistant suddenly came up to him from behind and said that he thought that perhaps Mikail was exaggerating the importance of this problem a little and was worrying too much about it. As soon as the guy heard this, he was immediately very surprised, after which he looked at his assistant and asked if he really thought so. The guy smiled happily and said that Lady Orleene, who had never even met the Grand Duke, was definitely not worried about her father worrying about her, so he assumed that Mikail was more family to her. He explained that children of this age do not want any jewels or crowns. All they want is the warmth of a caring guardian, and Mikail is the only person who could do this in this situation. The man seriously thought about it. However, at that moment, a maid suddenly knocked on the door of the room. The man allowed her to enter and immediately asked what had happened. The young maid was a little worried in the meantime. She said that His Highness the Crown Prince had arrived to see them, and so she asked what she needed to do. As soon as Mikail heard about this, he was very surprised. Of course, he did not expect that Percival would come to them for some reason. But then he suddenly thought about it and realized that the reason for his appearance was precisely because his stepdaughter fainted, and her fainting was apparently because of the Crown Prince. In the end, he did allow him to enter, and when Percival sat opposite Mikail, he said that he would like to meet Orleene. The boy was really very nervous and didn't know what to do. However, the man suddenly said that unfortunately it was not possible for him to meet her. Percival was very surprised to hear this. However, the man explained that the doctor strictly recommended complete rest for the girl, so he asked His Highness to return to his place. The boy said in a trembling voice that he understood everything, after which he waved his hand towards his escort so that he could hand over the thing that he had brought with him, and then his knights handed over a huge box of jewels. He said that he would like Mikail to give it to the girl, and then he would definitely leave. The man, seeing all these jewels, could not hold back his smile. He thanked him for this gift. However, he said that, from the imperial family, he needed to give his family a proper explanation of the whole situation. After that, he simply took and threw them out the door and said that their meeting was over. Then Percival looked at Gregum, who was his assistant, and asked what he needed to do now. After all, he considered this situation hopeless. His assistant smiled nervously and said that he thought it would be best to leave now, because that would just make them even angrier. But when His Highness did not react to this in any way, the man asked what he was going to do because the boy was noticeably lost in thought. Percival suddenly started running away. He said that he had to see the girl himself, so he asked Greg the Boar to hold everyone else until he did everything that was needed. The man was very surprised. However, he had no choice at that moment, and the door suddenly opened from the room, and Mikail appeared from there. The man, meanwhile, was very upset because he didn't know what to do with Mikail, while His Highness would be walking around and solving his problems. However, he had no choice. He needed to come up with something. When Percival walked through the estate and saw this tense atmosphere, he immediately thought that there was clearly something wrong there. It was unusually quiet around. I felt some kind of terrible haste, and even some kind of emptiness. The boy immediately became wary. It seemed to him that something would be wrong. In the imperial palace, in fact, it was always very warm and cozy. Everyone around was friendly and always smiling. Even the atmosphere of the walls was different. However, in this place where he found himself, there was no warmth in the air, only a lingering cold. So Percival did not understand how it was possible to live in this place at all. He didn't know if he would be able to find Orleene before he was caught, but he was going to do it very persistently, because he really didn't want to be deprived of sweets. So he had to apologize to the girl and get her forgiveness. In fact, if he knew that everything would happen this way, then of course he would never have forced her to be offended. But on the contrary, he would have even made sure that everything was okay with her. He just wants to apologize to her, and therefore Percival did not understand at all why her guardian did not allow him to do this, because it should not have taken much time. Soon he approached one of the rooms and saw that sunlight was visible from there. The door to that room was open, and Percival was immediately surprised by this. He decided to go up and check who that room belonged to in the end. And before he went inside, I immediately thought that it didn't look like a servant's room at all. As soon as he was inside, he immediately felt the sharp aroma of flowers, as well as the bright sunlight that was coming from there. After that, he looked more closely and saw a little girl whose hair was like sunlight melted into platinum, and her eyes were the color of rose quartz. This pale little porcelain face belonged to Lady Orleene, and the girl turned her head towards the guest who came into her room. As soon as she saw Percival, she was very shocked. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing in this place. But the boy himself was actually a little surprised. He didn't expect Orleene to be so beautiful. The girl asked him what brought him to this place. Percival was very worried at that moment. He also felt an incredibly strong heartbeat and did not understand why this was happening at all, because he did not think that this was possible. Orleene, meanwhile, asked His Highness if he was going to tell her anything at all, because all this time he stood at a small distance from her and simply remained silent. After finally addressing the boy several times, Orleene realized that he had to answer, so he thought about what he should tell her. For some reason, his face was all hot, and he told the girl in a trembling voice that he was just trying to apologize to her, but he himself did not understand why he was so worried about all this. But they described that he still gained strength. He turned to the girl and asked for forgiveness. The boy said that in fact he really didn't think that she could have fainted. He was very sorry that she had to go through something like that. Also looking down, he said that he would never allow something like this to happen again, but Orleene took it completely calmly. She said that things like this happen sometimes, so he didn't need to worry. She said that everything was fine with her, and that was the most important thing. As soon as the guy heard this, he was very surprised because he thought that she was offended by him. But Orleene passed by His Highness and said that besides, she knew perfectly well that when she ran, she would faint, so he definitely didn't need to worry about it. It was her choice in the end. The guy was about to say something when suddenly she extended her hand to him and asked if he had really snuck into this place, hiding from everyone. As soon as the guy heard this phrase, he immediately asked why she assumed this, and Orleene calmly explained that Mikail would definitely never have allowed this, so she assumed that he got in on his own. But the girl smiled and said that she would definitely keep this information a secret, so he could now calmly leave and not worry about anything. She explained that she still needed rest, as she had not fully recovered from that short run, so she wanted to be left alone. Percival, leaving the door, immediately said that it was really so. She needed rest, so he again asked her forgiveness and said that he would not disturb her. After that, Orleene told him to take care of himself when he returned and to be careful. Then she just went and closed the doors without even saying goodbye properly. The guy just stood there for a while after he walked out the door. He thought it was all incredible and didn't understand what had just happened. However, he thought about the fact that he was the crown prince, so he should have received a completely different treatment. Percival was confused because of this and did not know how to treat such a situation. Meanwhile, some of the maids who were going to the palace suddenly became very worried. One of the maids saw that Lena was spying on someone, and she immediately became interested. When the girl came up and asked what happened, her partner said that His Highness had just left the young lady's room, so she needed to go there immediately to check if everything was okay there. The maid, who was carrying the medicine on a tray, was very surprised. She was about to approach the room when she suddenly turned around and saw Mikail. The man just stood in front of the door. He looked very upset and at the same time serious, as if he wanted to say something, but for some reason could not dare. The butler saw that the maid was watching this and said that this day was a terrible time for Mikail, who had recently been on the verge of a breakdown. Therefore, one must act very carefully in order not to get caught in the crossfire. After that, he asked if perhaps he should bring this medicine tomorrow, so as not to disturb either the girl or her guardian once again. The maid seriously thought about this proposal. However, she believed that these medicines should be taken on time and did not understand why these two people were behaving in this way at all. She thought that it was too reckless on their part, but when she stood and watched Mikail, she thought that he was like a real wolf who was hunting an unfortunate sheep. It seemed to them that he could easily yell at the girl only if she did something wrong. One of the maids decided to leave because Mikail's face was really very threatening and asked her partner to also take care of herself. However, the maid could not afford this. She had to bring the medicine. Mikail, meanwhile, thought seriously about the words of his assistant, who said that children of this age needed the gentle warmth of their guardian. He understood perfectly well that while his master was away, he was the only one who could protect this girl, and gentle warmth might not be under his control. However, at least he could continue to stay close to her and show his care. The guy knocked, and entering the room, turned to the lady and asked if everything was okay with her. Orleene, looking at Mikail, thought that he really had gotten to her, and because of this, she immediately became wary. The girl was sitting by the window and drinking tea. She said that she was fine and that she didn't need anything. The man, hearing this, immediately looked at her with a very stern look. But then he sighed heavily and said that he wanted to ask her for forgiveness. He sat down to be on her level and said that he really didn't want to interrogate her. Therefore, he was very sorry that she thought that it could be like that. Orleene, as soon as she heard these words, was very surprised. She did not understand why he looked so worried, because it was even difficult for him to construct a proposal. She immediately wondered if she really wasn't just a burden to him, as she considered the time that he was forced to bear simply because his master told him to. Orleene knew perfectly well that they were not a family at all, and that they were not connected by any deep moral ties. They were simply a guardian and his ward, and this had been going on for a long time, as long as the girl could remember. That was exactly how it was. In order to lighten the mood a little, she smiled and said that she had seen him quite often lately. She said that he was probably incredibly busy, so she wanted to add that he should get back to work, but the guy interrupted her. Mikail said that she shouldn't even think about it, but Orleene told him not to waste his time on her. She would just continue to be silent and behave well, as if she didn't exist at all. The girl does not want to create problems for him, and for this very reason, she decided to stick to this tactic. But as soon as Mikail heard this, he was very surprised, because he could not even suspect that she felt this way. For a while, he just looked at her. But after that, standing up on his feet, he bowed before his lady and said that, of course, if this is what the lady wants, then he will do it. However, she had to remember that she was not a burden at all. After that, he turned around and left. Meanwhile, Orleene continued to drink her tea and wondered why they had such a strange conversation. The man, meanwhile, began to head to his office and did not understand why the girl was so angry. He could not believe that now she decided that she could simply ignore him if he did not interfere with her path. He didn't know if he was telling her to stop acting like a guardian, but in reality he never wanted to force a child to wear such a miserable expression on her face as the girl had. Of course, it was very difficult for Mikail. However, he must understand that it was even more difficult for her, and because of this realization, he was very sad because he did not want to cause her even more inconvenience. After some time, the maid finally came into the girl's room. She said that it was time for her to take her medicine. Orleene never liked this process because this medicine was simply disgusting to taste, and she had to drink it quite often and in large quantities. In fact, she started taking these medications when she was a very small child. She did not know who created them. However, it prevented her unpredictable attacks and seizures. It also helped her body, which had been destroyed by this terrible disease, to recover at least a little so that she could basically function throughout the day. After Orleene drank the medicine, she asked where Uni was, since she was usually the one who brought her medicine. The maid smiled and replied that Miss Uni had been called to an urgent meeting, so she had to come instead. The girl, hearing this, said that she understood everything, and she herself became a little interested in this, because even considering the meeting, Uni never left her. After that, she thought about this maid and realized that it was the only girl who always spoke behind her back, and yet she was so feignedly friendly in front of Orleene that it made her feel sick. The girls were really very uncomfortable being around this man. After she drank all the medicine, the girl said that she could go. The maid immediately bowed and did so. And so, finally, she found herself completely alone in the room. No one was supposed to come in to her. And what about the next morning? So Orleene was going to enjoy the beautiful, peaceful, and quiet atmosphere. Percival had returned home in the meantime, and he was a little upset because Gregum, who was the chamberlain of the crown prince, had recently been desperately wanting to resign. And the reason was actually that the crown prince had recently become very infatuated with Lady Orleene. He was literally constantly thinking about this girl and developing various strategies. He wanted to know as much as possible about this child and did not understand why the girl was so sick, and also could not believe that no medicine could be found to cure her. When they were already returning home and were in the estate, Percival constantly talked about Orleene. He said that she said goodbye to him before leaving, and he was sure that this could definitely mean something. The guy thought that this could be a very good sign. After that, he asked Gregum what the man thought about the girl in general, and what she could do in her free time. He was really very interested in all of this. Now, when some time had passed since that moment, Percival was very happy because he hoped that Orleene would come to meet his childhood friends that day. He would really like to meet her again, and this was the perfect occasion for this. Gregum, who was already tired of all this talk about the little girl, said that everything was exactly as it was. Her Highness's health had improved significantly, and she had warned him that she would be present at this event. However, as soon as they entered the banquet hall, where many people had already gathered, they saw that Lady Orleene had somehow just taken and left. She was not with everyone else. Of course, as soon as Percival did not notice her, he was very surprised. He told his assistant that he sincerely believed him that she would be present at this event, but he disappointed him. In fact, Greg really dreamed of this dismissal. He really wanted to spend at least some time in silence, because these conversations about Orleene had tired him out beyond belief. But the man did not react to this remark in any way. He was reserved, so he simply bowed before the gentleman and lowered his head. Percival was not at all happy with this. He turned to the sinner and asked if this was really the best thing he could do in such a situation, and also asked the man if he had listened to him well at all. Ultimately, due to Orleene not being present at the event, the childhood friends meeting ended much earlier than usual, and of course, Graham was very disappointed about this. He thought that, at least then, he would be able to be alone with his thoughts, while the boy would be having fun with the children. Percival himself did not understand why the boy reacted so sharply to all this. He assumed that, most likely, it was because he began to blame him. However, there really was a part of his guilt in this. After a short silence, the guy sighed heavily and said that he probably wouldn't see her again. However, in fact, he missed this girl so much and really wanted to meet her at least once more. He rose from his seat and, turning to the Greek, said that he considered that there was no reason for him to wait any longer until some other event. Smiling happily, the guy said that since Orleene couldn't come to him, he could just come to her and spend time in her estate. And of course, the boy was not going to stop. He got ready pretty quickly, took his assistant, and went straight to the estate to the girl. As soon as the knight who was standing outside saw him, He was very surprised. Percival looked at him angrily and told him not to delay. He opened the door for him as quickly as possible. The boy was already impatient to meet his friend. Gregum stood behind him in the meantime and felt a strong headache. After all, the boy had been buzzing his ears off while they were riding in the carriage. Then the man asked if he should first inform them that the man wanted to visit their Percival. He immediately said that of course this should be done. However, then he stopped and thought about something. After some thought, he said that if he suddenly showed up and gave them a surprise, it could be much more fun. So he said that they were changing their plans and asked Gregum to just follow them. Of course, the man didn't like all this. He really hoped that it wouldn't bring them even more problems, because he was well aware that Mikail wouldn't be very happy, even with a visit with a warning. But soon they were still allowed into the estate. The guy went up to the top floor, and they tried to walk quite quietly so that no one would notice. Percival tried to go by memory and find the girl's room. He was sure that he was quite close, and he also felt that the atmosphere in the mansion was very unstable. Before, it was cold and very lonely. However, this time, the air was really tense. The guy did not understand why this was happening. However, soon he walked a little further and heard the conversation of the maids, one of whom was talking about something very emotionally. He quickly approached them from behind and began to eavesdrop on the conversation. Gregum immediately asked what he was doing. However, the boy gestured for him to be quiet and not interfere. Then he heard one of the maids start talking about the situation that happened during the day when she was giving medicine to the girl. After she made a face, she told the maid to leave quickly. She called the girl a very rude word and said that she acted as if she was the most important in the estate. However, without Mikail's lineage, she was definitely nothing, and yet he continued to consider her a part of the family only because he was a temporary guardian. As soon as Percival heard all this, he was very shocked. He could not believe who exactly these two maids were talking about, because he could not even imagine such disrespect on the part of servants towards their masters. He really felt like he had to find out what exactly this conversation was about, because he didn't clearly grasp the whole point, due to the fact that she was walking at a great distance from them. So he went after the maids, and then one of the others said that even if he was a colonel, he was still a nobleman. And how many people thought that they could address Lord Mikail so coldly? Although this is not so. The other one, smiling happily, said that in fact, if we are being honest, without Lord Mikail, he would have disappeared long ago. The woman laughed loudly and said that he was a real useless nobody. Everyone knew that he would die very soon, and even despite this, he still did not know his place. Then the Percival was completely tired of hearing all these terrible things. He came closer to the girls and in a rough voice asked who they were talking about and who exactly did not know their place. The maids, hearing whose voice it was behind them, were immediately surprised and turned to see who was addressing them. Well, as soon as they saw the boy, they immediately became wary. Horror appeared before their eyes. Gregum was also very angry at the same time, because he heard this conversation perfectly well and knew that these were terrible words. He looked at them with disgust and told them to immediately kneel down and show respect, because Percival was not a man to be looked down upon like they had just done. The maids immediately bowed before His Highness, but they themselves did not understand how he ended up in the estate, and for what reason no one warned them about this. Then one of the maids, having gathered courage, with a trembling voice asked His Highness what had happened and why he had stopped them so abruptly. Percival came closer to them and asked if they really thought they had the right to ask him questions. Then, in a rough voice, he replied that he was actually the one asking, and no one was answering. So he said that he was interested in what they had just talked about, so he wanted them to tell him about it. So he asked again who they thought didn't know their place. One of the maids' hands even started shaking incredibly hard. They didn't say anything, and the guy thought that the gutter that was born with the intention of harming someone in order to destroy them was right in these girls. Faced with such an outrage, the likes of which he had never seen before, he didn't even understand why a strong cold rose in Percival's chest. He wanted to scold these women and even punish them for what they dared to do. The guy had never felt anger before. However, now he understood what these feelings were, so when the girls didn't say anything to him, he turned to them and said that just a minute ago, They had been talking absolutely freely and wanted to continue their dialogue. However, for some reason, now they were both silent, he turned to one of the maids who spoke the most and asked if her tongue had really been cut out since she couldn't say anything. At that moment, in fact, a lot of people began to gather around. They discussed this situation and did not understand at all how this could have happened. Everyone around immediately became interested in what kind of situation had happened. However, the man thought that all the anger would get out of control if this continued, so he wanted the ladies to answer him faster. At that moment, fortunately for the maids, Mikail came out to them, who was nearby and heard some strange sounds. He saw the crown prince and asked him in surprise what he was doing in this place. The man didn't receive any warning, and he also saw that his maid was kneeling and asked what kind of situation they had. One of the maids looked at Lord Mikail and was about to say something, but they were both crying. Their bodies were shaking with fear. They couldn't even say a single word clearly. However, at that moment, one of the maids looked through the crowd and saw a small blonde girl who was standing and also watching all this. It was, of course, Orleene. The maid immediately ran to this girl. She took her hand and began to ask her for forgiveness. The maid begged her for mercy just like the second one. They asked her to forgive her. They said that they were sincerely sorry that everything had become so boring and everything like that. However, the Percival who was watching all this sighed heavily and said that this was all very stupid. He asked if they really thought that this request could change anything at all. The guy looked at them with real hatred and asked if they still didn't understand the whole situation that had happened. However, he then said that it was quite obvious given their stupidity and folly. Then Percival finally decided to explain the situation that happened. He said that these two girls called their master an idiot and a half-human in his own mansion. He did not understand how they even dared to think about such a thing. And as soon as Mikail heard this, he was sincerely amazed. Just like Orleene, she looked at these maids and could not believe that this was really true. At that moment, one of the other maids who came up to them suddenly sank down in front of the mistress and asked if this had really happened to her before. Orleene was completely calm and said that in fact it had. The girl explained that before they had only bullied her. However, it was the first time she had heard that the master in the house was bullied. As soon as the maid heard that the girl had been bullied, she was very shocked. She took her hand and in a quiet voice asked why she didn't tell them anything about this. But Orleene replied that this is not true. After all, what they say is all a lie. So knowing this, she was not going to pay so much attention to such things. As soon as her faithful maid heard this, she was very surprised. She did not understand what the girl was talking about at all, so she asked her to explain. However, Mikail would have interrupted their conversation before the girl could answer. He said that this was enough and asked that everyone present go to their designated places. Meanwhile, Grecham turned to him and asked what they were supposed to do with these two maids, because he believed that they needed to be punished somehow or something like that. But Mikail started to leave. He told the guy to lock them in prison and, of course, interrogate each one personally in order to find out as much useful information as possible. After everyone had left, Percival immediately ran up to Orleene, who was standing and about to go to her room. He asked how she had chewed all this time. The girl was a little surprised when she saw him. She thought that she should have stayed in her room. But in fact, she didn't think that there could be so many irritating factors in the corridor, including the crown prince. The guy, meanwhile, began to walk around her from all sides and asked if her health was okay, if her condition had improved, and if it had been hard for her body to stand for so long all this time. Orleene ignored all his questions. She simply asked how he ended up in her estate. The guy was a little disappointed that she didn't answer him. However, he said that he came to visit her in the hospital, but she didn't come to the meeting, so he thought that maybe Orleene got sick again and she got worse. He said that he had decided to go here and check everything with his own eyes. The girl immediately replied that she understood, but said that everything was fine with her, so he didn't have to worry. However, hearing this information, she thought that this was even stranger than before. At first, Percival and Orleene had absolutely no common ground for them to become friends, so all the time they were just strangers. Therefore, the girl could not imagine at all what kind of change in his heart could make the guy go to her in the hospital. This was very strange for her. Of course, Orleene thought he was quite nice. However, right now, she didn't have the peace of mind to enjoy this kindness, so she simply thanked him for visiting her estate and asking how her health was. Percival, hearing this, was even a little embarrassed. He immediately said that there was nothing wrong with it. Sometimes it seemed to him that he was interfering where he shouldn't. However, when he saw even this situation with the maids, he simply couldn't stay away. Orleene thanked him for this too, but said that next time she would like to deal with all this herself, because she could thus put His Highness in a difficult position, and she would not want that. The guy was very upset at that moment. He asked if he was too intrusive, and that was why she was upset. But despite the fact that Orleena really thought so, she said that it was not so. The girl thanked him anyway for everything, and asked for forgiveness for the fact that she may have been a little rude at first. But in fact, his silhouette began to blur before her eyes, which made it difficult for her to even stand. Orleene tried to smile. However, she realized that on this day she felt much stranger than usual, and began to curse her body, which was very fragile, with all sorts of terrible words. Before leaving, the girl said that usually she could offer him a glass of juice. However, there was no time for that in the house now, and she began to feel not very well. Therefore, she asked him for forgiveness. She said that she had to say goodbye to him in that place. Of course, when Percival heard this, he was a little upset, but soon he said goodbye to her and thanked her even for such a short conversation. Orleene, meanwhile, turned to one of the maids and asked her to accompany them and make sure that they really left. After this situation that happened, the girl began to return to her room. She was accompanied by a maid whom she trusted. The maid asked if it was true that the lady was probably very tired that day from all these emotions and terrible situations. Orleene didn't even really listen to her because there was a lot of noise in her head. She felt dizzy, and wherever she looked, all the pictures blurred. Soon the girl was unable to stand on her feet at all. She felt too bad and lost consciousness. Orleene fell to the ground, and the maid, seeing this, immediately panicked. She ran up to the girl and felt her pulse. Because of this, she was able to at least exhale a little. After that, she immediately began to call people for help, because the fact that Orleene fainted was clearly a bad sign. At that very moment, Mikail was in his office. He called the butler there and asked if he really needed to worry about such issues at all. The butler asked him for forgiveness. However, the man said that of course he should be ashamed of everything that happened. He asked if he understood where the man was, how much this incident had hurt the name of this family. The man really realized how serious this was, so he said that he would take full responsibility and resolve the issue properly. Mikail glanced at him and said that it would be best for him to resolve all this in a clean way. He would like to keep him around for a long time. Therefore, the head butler must act very carefully. The man immediately said that he understood everything, and after that, he left Mikail alone. The guy was very disappointed at that time. He thought that even if it was because of Lady Orlene's sudden change in attitude, it was indeed so. He had been shocked quite often lately, and he didn't like this state at all. His nerves had become too sensitive, and the atmosphere in the estate had become very unstable, and this did not suit him at all. His attempts to be considerate towards the young lady eventually resulted in her overhearing a conversation she should never have heard in the first place. Before he had time to think about anything more, someone suddenly came into the room. His assistant himself turned to Lord Mikail and said that it was very urgent. Mikail was not happy that Dylan interrupted him because he was about to go eat since he hadn't even eaten anything yet. So in an angry voice, he asked the man what happened. Bowing, she wanted to say what happened to Mrs. Orleene. However, Mikail interrupted her and said that she warned that she wanted to do a little exercise before resting, and therefore asked that no one disturb her. The man understood that Mikail was completely unaware of what had happened, so he screamed loudly and said that Lady Orleene had just lost consciousness as soon as her guardian heard this. He was very surprised. He couldn't believe that it was really true. Then the man explained that the attending physician had already been brought in. The maid laid the girl on the bed, and the doctor had to examine her. He also asked if they needed to contact the magic tower, so that they could possibly intervene in all of this as well. They wanted to contact the temples, but Mikail went to resolve this whole issue before he went to his adopted daughter. The maid who had been with Orleene all this time noticed that she was showing symptoms of marital infidelity and because of this, she became even more wary. At that moment, Mikail finally reached the girl's room and asked as soon as he entered what her condition was at that moment. The maid tried to calm him down. She said that, unfortunately, she didn't know what was wrong with her. She just suddenly lost consciousness, and now her whole body was paralyzed. Mikail interrupted her and asked what the attending physician was doing at that moment. The maid explained that he had examined her earlier and now went to prepare medicine for the girl. She also said that he said that this evening could be very difficult, so they should prepare themselves. Mikail was very worried about this. The man could not understand why the attack began so suddenly. Then the maid replied that the doctor assumed that it could be due to excessive psychological stress that was experienced that day. She also explained that even a normal stable condition can deteriorate for reasons unknown to them, so there was no explanation. The maid also said that the young lady felt fine. It was only because of the medication that her health had never been good, so the danger always existed. As soon as Mikail heard about the medicine, he immediately asked if the girl had taken it that day. The maid immediately said that this was indeed the case. However, then she suddenly remembered one moment and immediately ran out of the room. The man was all on edge. He asked what it was. However, at that moment, he suddenly heard Orlene's groans. She was whispering to her mother. The girl was crying and reaching out with her hands. In fact, at that moment, she was dreaming of a terrible nightmare that repeated itself over and over again, and its beginning was always the same. She was in a remote room, next to an antique piano and a violin that was in her hands before she even realized it. And after that, she saw in front of her her mother, who was a beautiful and talented woman, and she was a daughter who was exactly like her mother, so they always had great hopes for her. However, her mother had only one wish in the whole world. She wanted her daughter to be the best, even better than her. Her mother always believed in the girl, and therefore believed that she would be able to fulfill the dream that a woman had. In the end, when the words "Mama" ended, the accompaniment from the piano began without an accompanist. This all happened in a dream, and Orleene already knew the entire plot of this dream by heart. All this familiar music filled the hall. However, the girl could not raise her hand in which she held the violin. She looked only at one person, who was sitting in the hall and was very important to her. Of course there was her mother. However, she never saw her face. It was dark, so Orleene could figure out from time to time what expression she had on her face when the girl couldn't even raise her hand to play a melody. Orleene burst into tears. She tried to appeal to her mother, but it was all in vain. She did not understand why the woman made her feel this way. She didn't even know what she could do for her. She tried to reach out to her mother and wanted to ask if she had ever loved her at all, because she was having more and more doubts about this. All the countless words she couldn't say were stuck in her throat. Orleene missed her, and all of them incredibly much. However, soon, after she played the melody, Mom would get up from her chair and leave. Then her violin fell, and the girl tried to run after it. However, eventually the stage disappeared, and she found herself in complete darkness. At that moment, Orleene could not believe that she would be left alone again in this terrible nightmare and darkness. She was then the only girl and simply fell to the ground and cried loudly because she felt hopelessness. However, the dream she saw that day was different. Now she felt someone's hand touching her palm. She did not see to whom it belonged because she continued to cry. The first thing Orleene thought, of course, was that it was her mother. But as soon as a calming, familiar voice leaned the girl against itself and said that everything was fine and that he was nearby, Orleene finally stopped seeing this dream and calmed down completely. Some time passed from that moment. Mikail did not leave the girl's side even a step. It was already completely dark outside, but she continued to sleep. He held her hand so that she would not be afraid. In fact, he instinctively took it and simply did not want to let go, because he was afraid that if he did, she would cry and convulse again. He thought that his lady had an incredibly kind heart. However, for some reason, even in her sleep, she called for her mother, whom she had never seen in her life. He knew that the truth was that she missed her so much. However, he couldn't believe that she had no one else to tell that she missed him too. And because of this, Mikail became even sadder. The man said in a quiet voice that he would now be there for her. Therefore, she no longer had to be afraid that she would be left alone. and even more so, call her mother, whom she had never even known in her life. A whole night passed since that moment. Orleene finally came to consciousness. As soon as she woke up, she saw a person sitting in front of her. Because she still had blurry silhouettes, she thought that it was her mother. But looking more closely, she saw that this person was Mikail. In fact, the girl even asked in a quiet voice, "Is this really Mom?" However, when she saw him, she realized that this was not so. The man then said in a quiet voice that unfortunately, he was not her mother for some time. Orleene simply looked at him with her beautiful big eyes. After a short, awkward silence, the man asked if she was feeling better because he was really worried. But the girl meanwhile continued to call him Mom. Mikail felt even more uncomfortable from this and said that, in fact, he is a man, so he definitely cannot even physiologically be her mother. Then Orleene suddenly started crying and kept calling for her mother. The man panicked a lot. He didn't know what he should do. Of course he didn't want to upset her. At that moment, the man thought that children are truly incomprehensible creatures, and he was clearly not given the ability to understand this girl. In fact, one day the Duke of Galberna brought a child home for the first time, and the dark public curiosity was directed to a completely different place. Of course, everyone around was very interested in who was the mother of this unfortunate child. Some said that she was the daughter of a harlot, while others believed that she was the illegitimate child of noble birth, who was hidden from scandal. But in this whole situation, one thing was certain, namely that she bore the blood of a Galbern, and that could not be changed. With the help of the Galbern Guardian Stone, which only reacted to blood relatives, they were able to verify that she really did have this blood. But even after this check, the maids did not stop talking about all this. They understood that the child was definitely from the Duke. However, they were still worried about the question of who her mother was. They assumed that perhaps this girl was the result of true love. However, Mikail was very strange to hear that Galborn could love someone. He considered it the most absurd thing he could ever hear, because the Duke of Galborn and love were clearly incompatible things. But he thought that all this should not concern him at all. He was not interested in the life of his boss, much less his love preferences. So the guy simply decided not to get involved in all this. However, it was only his choice. The man eventually realized that Orleene must have felt differently when she heard all these conversations. Of course, being in the very center of all these rumors, she wondered who her parents really were. And of course, he was shocked by the fact that she had never in her entire life asked about her mother. He thought that she was interested in this. However, he did not understand for what reason then. She avoided all these conversations. He was well aware that one day such a day could come, and he even prepared approximate answers, just in case, so as not to get confused. However, this child ultimately never asked a single question about his parents. Therefore, at some point, everything began to simply feel natural, and Mikail completely forgot that such an interest could ever arise. He even stopped asking himself such questions, so he assumed that perhaps the girls really weren't that interested in knowing all this. However, now that Orleene was sitting in front of him in tears and calling him mother, he realized that he had probably been wrong about that. I assumed that perhaps she had not been indifferent at all this time. She had simply kept it to herself, so as not to disturb everyone around her unnecessarily. Orleene, meanwhile, continued to cry. She was sure that she woke up from this nightmare. However, now it was no longer a dream, but for some reason she could not stop calling for her mother. Her throat was very dry. Words simply could not come out of her mouth when she saw Mikail in a confused state. And I became very uneasy because she did not want to leave him in such a difficult situation. She continued to cry and call for her mother. Even though the man was trying to address her, the girl seemed not to hear him at all. Soon, sighing heavily, the man turned to her and said that what she called him did not matter at all. At this stage, therefore, he allowed her to call him as she felt comfortable. Orleene, hearing all this, felt even stranger in Mikail, whom she knew without thinking about twerk. He would not have allowed her to act arbitrarily like that. But now, for some reason, everything was different. Then suddenly, through tears, she turned to him and said that he did not love her at all, and he did not like her. When the guy heard this, he was very surprised and immediately said in a rude voice that this was all not true, and also asked why he could have these reasons to hate her. But Orleene said that he was a liar. The guy immediately replied that it was not a lie. He really did not understand why he had to hate her. The girl finally began to calm down. She then asked in a quiet voice, "Didn't he want her to leave? He just took and pushed her away." The man, hearing all this, immediately understood what she was talking about. He called her Lady Orleene. However, she did not even look in his direction because she was too upset. Then he called her by her shortened name. And as soon as she heard this, a hope flashed through her soul. She immediately felt pleased to hear this nickname. Mikail suddenly reached out his hand to the girl and, stroking her head, said that he was an orphan. He said that he doesn't know who his parents are. He's never even seen their faces, even in photographs. He doesn't know if they abandoned him or died. All this information was unfamiliar to him. He continued to stroke her head tenderly and said that he had never had anyone take care of him. Then he decided to move on to the topic of love and said that she wasn't even sure that she understood what this word actually meant, and he wanted to be honest with her. That's why he said that even now he still didn't know how he should treat a lady. Orleene, hearing all this, was very surprised. But then suddenly the guy, smiling happily, said that this never meant that he wanted to reject her and not contact her in any way. He explained that it was all because of his own shortcomings. He thought that if he couldn't raise her well, then at least he could raise her without shortcomings. But now he realized that he had been too naive. The man wiped the tears from her face and said that he realized that he had made big mistakes in his upbringing and that he was very ashamed of it. Orleene suddenly turned away from him and told Mikail that he hadn't really done anything wrong, so she didn't want him to blame himself for anything. The man then asked if she could forgive him, but the girl continued to insist on her own and explained that he had done nothing for which she should forgive him. Mikail sighed heavily and summed up that this meant that she was still not ready to simplify it. But then suddenly, the girl quietly called him mother again. He asked again what she was saying because he had not heard her well. Then she told him to call himself mom. If he really wanted to apologize to her, he had to do it. Mikail didn't like all this at all. He told the girl that in fact he was male, so calling himself a mother would not be very correct in his opinion. She took him by the sleeve and put his hand on her knee. She continued to call him mom and wanted him to do the same. Her guardian sighed heavily and said that biologically it was, of course, wrong to do so. However, he would try to do everything possible to justify the title that the girl decided to give him. Orleene, hearing this, was really pleased. In fact, Mikail, whom she knew, was always rational and logical. He was definitely not the kind of person who would give in to children's whims. However, for some reason, this time the man decided to make concessions to her. It was a little hard for her to believe it. However, she decided to trust him. In fact, for the first time in all this time, Orleene really liked this answer that Mikail said, so she even looked him straight in the eyes and smiled happily. After a long silence, the man said that this was a very good sign, and also asked that in the future she smile more often in this way, because the smile suited her exactly. Some time passed since then. It was already getting dark outside again, and a special healer finally came to them. Mikail stood for a while and watched the whole procedure. However, he soon decided to go out, so as not to disturb them. He turned to the maid who was nearby and still decided to find out what exactly happened. But in the end, he never heard the whole story. The girl was very worried. She said that she thought that someone had stolen the medicine and that this was the reason why her health had deteriorated in this way. As soon as Mikail heard about this, he immediately asked what she meant. He became wary because he understood that there was clearly something bad there. Then the maid explained that on the day when the young lady was supposed to take the medicine, Mikail was nearby, so she did not receive it right away. The girl forgot the next day because she did not sleep all night. However, another maid said that by providing it for the girl, she thereby saved her. In the end, it turned out that it was the maid who caused the commotion yesterday. And besides, when she came to confirm this, the maid was already dead in prison, so she could not verify what actually happened. As soon as Mikail heard about the death in prison, he was very surprised and asked what the reason was. The maid explained that some people say that she hanged herself. However, there was no exact information about this. Mikail understood that the probability that it was suicide was small, So he decided to move on to another topic and asked if there were traces of the stolen medicine. The maid immediately said that they found nothing. Then he said that for now they would treat it as suicide and move on. After that, he asked Uni if anyone else knew about this whole incident. The maid immediately replied that no one knew about it, and Mikail asked her to keep it a secret and focus on the health of the young lady as well as everyone else. The maid bowed and said that she understood everything, after which she left, and Mikail went to his office. He was still thinking about this whole situation. He couldn't believe that these women actually had the courage to do something like that to him. It was a very low act, and they did it on his estate under his leadership. Of course, Mikail was not going to just leave this situation like that, so he had already begun to think through a plan of action on how to avoid similar situations in the future. Several days passed from that moment, and when the doctor came to Orleene again, he said that she was already much better. Her heartbeat was normal, and her reaction to Manu was good. The man was very happy when he heard this. However, the doctor said that they still needed to monitor her further, but this level of improvement was truly amazing because they didn't think that everything would happen so quickly. The doctor also said that she had become much more psychologically stable and asked what the man needed to do for her to improve so quickly. Mikail thought about it at that moment and said that, in fact, he had not done anything special. However, he then remembered that, throughout all these days, he had been constantly near the girl and suggested that perhaps this could have had some influence. The doctor then said that no matter what, he was still worried about the fact that over time, the princess's body was becoming weaker and weaker, and even the medicines were not helping to slow down this process. He already wanted to say something, but Mikail stopped him and told him not to say that anymore. The doctor bowed and asked him for forgiveness. He really understood that not everyone wants to hear bad news. The man, meanwhile, told him that the attending physician had no need to apologize at all. He simply wanted him to pay even more attention to the health of the young lady and focus on that. The doctor replied that he understood everything and would definitely fulfill this request. After that, Mikail thought that it was truly a miracle that the girl could continue to speak and move, and that she returned to normal. At this point, the doctor had already left, and the man sat down opposite the girl, who had already woken up in the meantime. She looked in surprise at Mikail's worried expression and immediately asked what was wrong, because she understood that he was hiding something from her. The man then replied that on that day for dinner, she would be able to eat absolutely anything she wanted. Therefore, it would be better for her to formulate her wishes in advance so that the chef would have time to prepare it. As soon as Orleene heard this, she was very surprised and asked if this was really true, and also said that it was a great relief for her. Well, the man was not so happy because he understood that her condition was bad, and therefore he had to do absolutely everything for her happiness. After all, no one knows when the day will be Orleane's last. Well then, after a short silence, the guy asked the girl if he could take her hand. As soon as Orleene heard this, she was very surprised. At first, she did not understand why he wanted to do this. However, she still allowed him. Mikail, in turn, believed that a small handshake could have a good effect on their contact with each other, so he was very glad that he was able to understand this in time. When he took her hand, the girl simply lit up with happiness. In fact, at that moment, the guy finally understood that he had to take care of her, and from that moment on, he was going to raise her well. At that very moment, there was a new gathering of childhood friends in the imperial palace. However, Percival was not at all happy about this meeting. Lately, he had little to be happy about. The children were all talking at that moment. They were trying to understand what had happened to the boy. However, no one knew, because the boy had simply closed himself off in his own little world and was not going to contact anyone. Gracchum, who was also present at the event, noted that absolutely everyone around was a little alarmed by the fact that Percival had changed his attitude towards these meetings. In fact, on this day, His Highness's condition was a little better or worse because a letter arrived at their estate stating that Lady Orleene had recently lost consciousness, so her attendance at this event could definitely not have happened. Of course, when Percival learned that she had lost consciousness again, he was very alarmed because he did not understand why this was happening and how people could lose all knowledge so often. He even suggested at one point that her body was made of glass. He was really very sad that the girl was still sick, and that she probably suffered quite a lot because of all this. Then suddenly, two Geminis who were his close friends approached Percival. One of them asked why the man was so upset, and his brother also turned to Percival and asked why the guy was so gloomy, because it was not like him at all. But Percival didn't even want to talk to them. He just told them in a rude voice to leave. He wasn't in the mood to play with them right now, so he just wanted to be alone. Well, the boys didn't leave him alone. One of them asked him what his mood was. If he wasn't in the mood to play with them, they had never heard that from him before. And his brother asked if he really wasn't in the mood to play with them. He had never seen him in such a mood before. Then Percival sighed heavily and said that in fact he had some concerns, and that was precisely why he did not want to communicate with anyone or play. The boys immediately started to unfold it about what kind of concern it was, because they were really very interested to know this. The guy decided to tell them about it anyway, so he said that a few days ago he had already gone to visit someone in the hospital, and he would like to go there again. The guy, as soon as he heard this, was very surprised. He didn't understand why Percival decided to ask them for permission at all. He said that if he wanted to visit someone in the hospital, then of course he could do it calmly. But Grecham, who was standing nearby and heard all this, immediately panicked. He didn't want the boys to allow this because it could only mean that he would have to indulge Percival again. In order to be completely sure, Percival asked if this was really so, and if they would not be against it. The boys immediately answered that of course he could visit whoever he wanted. Of course, he was immediately happy to hear this, so getting up from his seat, he turned to everyone and asked them for forgiveness. He said that he had to leave because he had one thing that needed to be done urgently. He turned to Science and told him to follow him because he still wanted to visit this man in the hospital. His assistant immediately ran after him, although he did not want this at all. As soon as the twins heard this, they immediately looked at each other. They became very interested in who he was going to visit because the boy never told them about it, and they didn't ask. Some time passed since then, and when Orleene was about to leave the room to take a little walk, a small surprise awaited her there. As soon as she opened the door, a man appeared in front of her, who first made her faint and then pretended as if nothing had happened. This man was the Crown Prince of Persia. He immediately saw Orleene and smiled happily. The guy ran up to her and asked if she was really very sick. He also said that they were telling him that she had fainted again. He began to bombard the girl with various questions, including the question of whether she usually fainted like that all the time, since this was the first time he had met people who had ever lost consciousness. At that moment, Orleene felt as if all the positive energy was about to be driven out of her because of this boy. It was as if he was a vampire who was going to take all her powers. When she didn't answer him, Percival asked what had happened, because she looked quite pale. He asked if he had done something wrong, and also asked if she was in any pain. But Orleene only asked if it really wasn't the day when the meeting of childhood friends was supposed to take place. The guy immediately smiled happily and said that it was exactly like that. He was happy that she remembered about it. The girl said that she certainly remembered this. Then she moved on to her main question and asked what he was doing at her estate, since he was supposed to have this meeting. Percival continued to smile and said that he heard that Orleene had lost consciousness, so he decided that it would be best to come and check on her and make sure that everything was okay. In fact, the Crown Prince was the most popular person in their empire and a man of power. However, Orleene was very surprised that he showed interest in her, neglecting all his old friends and acquaintances. How could she have guessed that after he left this event, everyone immediately started discussing him, because that was the nature of aristocrats, even though they were still very young. Orleene, meanwhile, continued to question him about all sorts of things. She asked if there was anything else he wanted to talk about or do besides this visit. But the guy said that he just decided to visit her. But Orleene still didn't understand his ultimate goal. Then he said that he did it because he missed her, and the girl, hearing this, was in a stupor. She was silent for a while, but then, turning to the Perseverance, she said that if he was constantly worried about her, because they thought that her fainting was His Highness' fault, then he definitely shouldn't have even thought about it, because that was not the case at all. Well, Persego didn't understand how he could not worry, because he really believed that all this was because of him, so he considered that it was his duty to worry about Orleene until she finally recovered. In fact, the girl could have expected this. She now understood that she could not get rid of the crown prince in any way, even though she absolutely did not want to have any contact with him. She thought that this man had a cunning plan in mind. She believed that he would carelessly scatter his kindness and affection, making her yearn for him, and then he would just take and disappear from her life one day. So she certainly wasn't going to give in to this feeling of affection and wanted to keep this person at a distance so that she wouldn't develop any feelings at all. Of course, for some people this may be very rude and impolite, but for Orleene, for whom every breath is a luxury, these were forced measures. She could not give in to anyone's attention, so as not to create false hopes for herself,